Here we go. Black Long. That's not much better than Black Bull.
Black Bull, I summon you.
I wonder what's long. Am I right? Stop me if you've heard this one before. An Eastern country decides to break into the Western AAA game market, and they do so by developing a game in a widely popular genre, obviously inspired by one of the greatest games of all time, but either due to the dev studio's lack of experience, or lack of innovation, or just generally lacking in polish or focus, the game doesn't quite hit the mark. While that description might have been a bit too vague for some of you, as I was playing Black Myth Wukong, I was immediately reminded of Atomic Heart, developed by a Russian studio, and you should remember Stellar Blade, released earlier this year, which was developed by a South Korean studio. And as I'm sure you already know, Black Myth Wukong was developed by a Chinese studio. And so, how is the game? Well, I'm sure I already described my basic feelings in the title. It's pretty good, but it's certainly missing something. Again, comparing this to Stellar Blade is pretty apt. It's a game that journalists hated for not being blatantly left-wing propaganda, though notably the biggest difference in controversy is Stellar Blade was hated for its sexy female characters, whereas Wukong is hated for having, like, no women in it at all. And also not having enough diversity, which I think we all know by now just transparently means there's no black people in it. Which is ridiculous because there's no white people in it either. All of the human characters are Chinese, as you would expect. And instead, primarily being a video game first and foremost. So for some of you, that's more than enough of a reason to support this game. But at the end of the day, I am a video game critic first and foremost. Yes, I despise left-wing ideology. You know that if you've been listening to this channel for more than a few months. But at the end of the day, I'm not going to be impressed by a 6 or 7 out of 10 video game that doesn't have any wokeness in it. And something I do want to point out, because you're definitely going to notice it in this comment section, is that a lot of the hype around this game has been clearly astroturfed by China. Despite selling over 10 million copies, which is definitely a success, I'm not going to deny that for a second, approximately only 1 million of that was outside of China. The vast majority of the Steam reviews for this game are in Chinese, barely any are in English, and when I live streamed this game for the first time to over 1,500 people, there were a hell of a lot of Chinese people who just kind of stumbled in and were complaining about every minor criticism I had of the game while playing. So I'm not telling you this to say you shouldn't support it just because Chinese people like it and are trying to make it as much of a success as possible, but the hype around this game is clearly not organic, and as you'll find out in this review, it is certainly not nearly as good as some people would have you believe. That being said, it is a decent game. I'm not going to try and pretend like it's mediocre or worse than that even, but I won't go into any more detail during this intro. So without further ado, let's journey to the west in Black Myth Wukong. So as usual, let's just dive right into the gameplay first. What type of game is Black Myth Wukong? Like I said, it's more or less a Souls-like. Now, similar to Stellar Blade, it is different enough from one that you can be forgiven for not calling it one and just saying it's kind of like hack and slash combined with minor Souls-like elements. But as the game becomes more challenging over time, you're definitely going to see the inspirations from the more recent Souls games like Bloodborne, Dark Souls 3, and Elden Ring, of course. Now, the basic combat is something that I've heard a lot of people praise, but I'll be honest, I think the mechanics are a little on the weak side. They're way too basic. Honestly, the worst part of it might just be your standard light attack combo. You press square several times in a row, and your character does the same exact light combo every single time. And even your heavy attack on triangle is only used when you build up a focus point. You get focus energy from hitting enemies, or you can charge it up by holding triangle. The stamina management portion of this game is nearly non-existent, even though you do have a stamina bar. Very early on, it gets extended to such a point that you're barely ever penalized for spamming square and occasionally pressing circle to dodge. Yes, of course, this is another game with a dodge roll with invincibility frames, and the invincibility frames are very generous. Now, something that might surprise some of you is that there's no dedicated block button in this game. This is definitely a roll spam game, without a doubt, even though you do gain a magic spell that allows you to parry basically any attack by turning to stone. Even that costs mana and has a cooldown. Which, to go off tangent for just a second, I do want to complain about the very poor translation of some of these menus. So this game has a generic skill tree system, which I'm not going to complain about at the moment, but it definitely felt very sloppish and probably the most like Western AAA aspect of this game. But that aside, a couple of these descriptions for the ability upgrades don't really make any sense, and Resolute Counter was probably the worst one. So it's under your might stance, and yes, this game has 3 different combat stances, which is why some people are comparing this to Neo. Personally, I liked Neo better than this game, but that's besides the point. So examine this wall of text right here. Now, my question is, what do you think this upgrade does? Do you think it's A, when you execute a heavy attack during a light attack combo, you enter a buffed state where you nullify enemy damage? Is it B, when you execute a heavy attack during a light attack combo with no focus point, do you enter a buff state where you nullify enemy damage? Is it C, when you execute a heavy attack during a light attack combo with the focus point, do you get an incredibly brief moment of invulnerability that is not signified on screen in any way, which, if you parry the attack successfully, then you stagger the enemy with the counter? For a move that is very useful in the early game, you would think that the localization team would have made sure it was very clear what this actually does, because it definitely makes the game a bit easier on you if you don't have to cancel every single combo into a dodge. But whatever, to get back to the core gameplay mechanics again, much like Stellar Blade, this is the type of game that is made vastly easier through the use of super moves that consume mana. These moves include immobilizing any enemy, including bosses, allowing you to get a bunch of free hits on them. You can turn invisible with the enemy attacking where you were last seen until you strike back with a counterattack, staggering them. You can consume your might meter to transform into a mini-boss that has its own completely unique moveset, animations, sometimes they have a super ability as well, and it's a free health bar, which, as you can probably guess, is easily the most broken ability out of your selection. And of course, there's other powerful abilities you get access to during your journey, like the Shadow Clones, and all of these magic spells feel pretty damn good to use. Not only are they really powerful, but they're just inherently satisfying. I really have nothing to complain about them. I think being able to turn into a select few mini-bosses is just a really good idea. Now, as for your other spells, they both have cooldowns and consume mana. And one of the weirder decisions of this game is that there is no mana potion. Outside of specific skill upgrades, there's no way to actually recover your mana bar except resting at a bonfire. And I think this was definitely done on purpose so that you were encouraged to save all of your magic spells for the bosses. And as you'll find out in just a couple hours in, there's a shit ton of bosses in this game, so there's no reason to waste your spells on fodder enemies. After defeating certain enemies that have a blue aura, you also get the ability to use spirits, which are a special short transformation that you activate by pressing L2 and R2 at the same time, which is basically just one super attack that you get. A lot of these feel completely useless, especially if they have no invincibility frames. You can actually just get knocked straight out of it immediately, and the damage usually isn't worth it either. So there's a few that are vastly more useful than other ones. It doesn't take a genius to figure out what the good spirits are. As you would expect, there's also usable items that can increase your elemental resistances, your defense, your attack. These definitely can make some boss fights easier. On top of all this, there's also a light RPG system where you can equip various gear that increases your defense. There's set bonuses that have special buffs if you equip multiple pieces of the same armor. There's actually different types of Estus flasks that do slightly different things, and you can equip items to modify a secondary effect of Estus as well. I actually kind of like the RPG mechanics in this game. In most Western AAA slop games, a lot of these RPG mechanics feel completely tacked on. A good example is like God of War 2018 and Ragnarok, where a lot of the buffs are like a 5% increase to damage or defense or something, which is just a fucking complete joke. Whereas in this game, a lot of these set bonuses actually make a significant difference, and you definitely feel the defense increase. And I know it might not sound like it, but I basically already described most of the moves you're going to be using for the entire game. This combat system is not very complex. Like I said, you're going to be spending most combats just spamming the square button and dodging when it's time to dodge. It's not quite a turbo style hack and slash a la, you know, Bayonetta or God of War or Devil May Cry or even something like Kingdom Hearts. This is definitely somewhere between those games and Souls games where you can actually get locked into certain animations and not be able to immediately dodge or parry or use a spell. The animation locking can definitely get annoying because this game feels like you're supposed to be able to do basically any action at any time, but that's just not the case. And the stamina meter, even though it's pretty generous, also helps slightly restrict how free-flowing the combat should feel, at least in my opinion. So it does feel weird when it's not your fault you get hit, because one move in your light attack combo is half a second longer than the other ones, right? Now, this game is definitely not nearly as difficult as Elden Ring. You can actually take at least 3 hits without dying, and most of the time it's more like 4 or 5. And although you get fewer Estus flasks than Souls games usually give you, given you have so many powerful tools at your disposal, you really don't need that much healing. You just need to memorize the boss movesets. Speaking of which, let's talk about the enemies. Now, this is where I'd say one of the bigger fuck-ups of this game is. The normal enemy variety in this game is actually fucking terrible. All of these enemies feel like trash mobs. There's very few standard enemy encounters that are actually challenging. A lot of times, you'll just fight 1 or 2 dudes who can die in one charged heavy attack. You kill them, and then you just run forward to the next enemy. Now, there's definitely some, like, Miyazaki-style traps where a bunch of undead will get up around you and attack you at the same time, or you'll get ambushed, or there could be a bunch of crossbow guys all shooting at you from an elevated ridge. But those are definitely the minority of encounters. Probably 10% of them are legitimately challenging, and the rest are just annoying padding. In fact, a lot of this game feels like padding, because there's so little exploration. It's basically just a series of linear hallways with copious amounts of invisible walls everywhere, which is really immersion breaking. The environments, although very detailed, feel pretty lifeless, and you definitely get sick of the biomes by the end of the levels. Especially the desert level is so long for such a boring looking area. Now, all of that complaining out of the way, I do legitimately have to praise something about this game. It's one of the few things that really makes it stand out, and that is the copious amount of bosses. There's a crazy amount of bosses in this game. This almost feels like a boss rush. Maybe it should have been, honestly. This has some of the most boss fights I've ever seen in any action game. It's legitimately impressive. I'm not going to downplay it on any level. Now, are all the bosses unique? No, but honestly, they don't really have to be. The mini-bosses are short enough and just varied enough that I pretty much enjoyed all of them. I do have some problems with the main boss fights, mainly that they have way too much health. There's quite a few bosses in this game where I was just mashing the square button for like 4 or 5 straight minutes. One of the worst offenders for this being a blatant plagiarized giant version of the crystal golems from Dark Souls 1. I mean, please tell me this is not just the same fucking model that they just stole from Dark Souls. That's what it feels like, really. I'll show you them side by side. And of course, just a few hours of gameplay after this, I encountered a much, much worse boss. At the end of the Pagoda Realm, which is essentially a prison, which I'll talk about a little bit later in this video because it is easily one of the worst parts of the game, you fight a boss, which is like some 4-legged animal creature with a giant golden orb as its head. And I have to say, with no exaggeration, this is one of the worst bosses I have ever fought in any action game. The gimmick of the boss is simple. You hit his foot to knock him over so you can hit his real weak spot, which is his head. All damage done to his foot is severely reduced. The only way to get full damage is by hitting the orb on his head. Okay, sounds simple enough, right? Well, you have to hit him a lot to stagger him, and his window of vulnerability is really not that long, and there's no reliable way to extend it either. You can use your immobilize spell, he just breaks out of it after a few hits, and then he's back on his feet. At bare minimum, you're going to have to stagger him 3 times over the course of the fight. This would be bad enough. But on top of this, at least twice he's going to enter an attack animation where he's completely invincible, where he shoots lasers all across the room, which essentially paints lines on the floor, and you have to stand in between them to not get hit with a super strong attack. But at the same time, you also have to dodge lightning bolts that are striking on top of your position. So even if you're standing in the right spot, you're still going to probably get hit by lightning. But really, the worst part is it just stalls the fight at least 30 seconds every time he does it. And the cherry on top of this horrible design is he has one of the worst hitboxes I have ever seen for his grab. His grab honestly doesn't even fucking look like a grab. He basically just jumps in the air, and when he comes down on top of you, it knocks you in midair and you're locked in the animation. It takes out like 80% of your health. And to make matters even worse, this boss has a special mechanic where if he gets off this sort of roar, wind chime, whatever, he goes into a special mode that you've been suffering from throughout exploring the prison, where it will cut your maximum health in half and add this annoying blur effect to the corners of your screen. And it also prevents you from using might to use one of your powerful transformations for a free health bar. Or if you're already transformed, it immediately knocks you out of it. The only way to prevent this is by staggering the boss before he gets it off, which is easier said than done. So if your maximum health has been cut in half and he hits you with the grab, that is a kill from full health to 0, with, again, a janky as fuck hitbox that can still grab you even if you're way behind him. No, what? How did that hit me? Dude, the hitboxes are so fucked in this game. When I finally beat him, it ended up taking nearly 10 straight minutes of wailing on him. It's not even like it's the hardest boss in the world, but expecting a player to consistently dodge attacks for that long is absolutely ridiculous for a game in this genre. And to complement another element to this game, there are a few bosses that have a unique gimmick that is actually pretty interesting. There are these dragons that are behind waterfalls, and the first one that you fight has these electric maces that he smacks and shoots waves all across the arena. And after losing about a third of his health, he enters a rage state where, in a rhythmic pattern, he slams the maces over and over again, shooting out a wave every time. And at first I thought, oh, you're supposed to jump over these. Well, he varies up the timing, so you'll eventually get caught and killed. Then I tried to dodge through them. That didn't really work out either. Then I tried the stance that allowed you to stand on top of your pole to dodge them. Well, I ran out of stamina, then got stun locked. And so after being utterly stumped, it turns out the solution was as simple as stand on top of the rocks in the arena to avoid the attack. Now, the catch being that the boss can actually destroy these rocks if you allow him to, right? So the challenge is to make sure that you corral him away from 1 or 2 rocks so that you always have a way to reliably avoid this attack. And hey, that's a pretty interesting gimmick. On top of the fact that, of course, he has a lightning-related debuff that can stun you, it actually felt like a pretty unique fight. And this is something you can notice in some of the other major boss fights as well. Like the tiger is where you get the stone parry ability from, so he can do that during the fight to throw you off guard. The rat sage can summon a giant sandstorm, including basically sand shadow clones that can attack you. And near the end of the fight, he summons a tornado that slowly chases you as the boss continues to attack you. And of course, I need to mention the Yin Tiger, a zodiac deity who's an optional boss in like a Painted World Pocket Dimension. Without a doubt inspired by Guts of Berserk fame, this tiger has a giant fucking sword, and this boss almost felt like a hybrid of a lot of the more challenging Elden Ring bosses with a lot of delay to his attacks and super long combos, combined with the old style of Souls boss that I much prefer, where each boss in the game had a specific gimmick, with this one being the tiger vanishing into the wind, right? But the trade-off being he really doesn't have that much health, especially compared to any of the main bosses, but he gave you so few windows of opportunity to attack him, including breaking out of your immobilize spell in just one hit. And so this boss fight almost felt like a puzzle of how you could output enough DPS with your mana bar to effectively beat him, since you're absolutely not gonna win unless you're just a god at this game by doing light combos. He's just not gonna give you a chance. So I ended up figuring out that if I combined 2 Shadow Clone spells along with my transformation into a 2-headed rat man that I had at that point, that I could output just enough DPS before I ran out of potions. But even so, man, this dude is so fucking aggressive. Again, it almost felt like the developers took heavy inspiration from the more challenging Elden Ring boss fights like Malenia, but actually gave it a unique twist to keep it interesting. And the tiger's health is just low enough that you're gonna be willing to just beat your head against the wall until you finally get it right. I may have been infuriated at the time when I played this on stream. What? I hit circle, you fucking bitch ass laggy piece of shit. Whoa, what? He just super armored right through that. He's super armored through the explode. Alright, yeah. I love how, you know what, timeout, everyone is suggesting me to fight this boss right now. Whoa, what? A new move. Never seen that move. Just fucking cheated and pulled a new move out his ass. Yeah, I forgot. This guy is what the? This Mary Sue piece of shit. I swear to fucking God, I'm losing it. But I have to admit, this is actually one of the better designed bosses in this game. With, of course, a great reward, giving you the ability to turn into the tiger and play as him. So again, there's just enough variety in these boss fights that I can't say it ever got tiresome. The biggest problem with these levels is everything in between the bosses feels so half-assed or just straight up padding to make the game length longer. It's obvious that a shit ton of the budget and time was put into these boss fights, when maybe they should have cut a few of the less interesting ones and developed a few more enemy types and maybe crafted more unique enemy encounters. So in summary, I'd say the combat is simple, but it's smooth and fast-paced. It's somewhat refreshing next to something like Elden Ring, where you're constantly on the defensive unless you're exploiting magical perfume that allows you to kill every boss in 2 or 3 hits, which of course they nerfed just days after my review released. Gee, I wonder why. But ultimately, the problems with this combat system are fairly obvious. Really, the biggest one being that you're going to be mashing square so much of this game. Even though there's 3 different combat stances, you're most likely going to be using the might stance for a significant amount of your playthrough, so you're going to see that same exact square, 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 square over and over and over again. And like I mentioned before, it is infuriating when you get trapped in a slightly longer animation and can't cancel into a dodge, or cancel into your resolute strike either, which kind of defeats the whole point of having a brief invulnerability period if you can't trigger it at any time. And the other huge problem being that the boss fights are the only fun encounters, really. Even the more challenging standard enemy fights, whether it just be a couple really strong guys or a whole gank squad, don't actually feel all that fun because you're not really equipped with tools to deal with them without wasting your mana bar. And as I've explained already, you don't want to waste your mana bar on anything that's not a boss. So these fights feel like they're trying to emulate Dark Souls' design without understanding that Dark Souls' mechanics were perfectly equipped for those types of encounters. This is the type of game where your attacks basically glue onto whoever you're locked onto. Despite the fact you wield a bow staff, it generally only hits the thing directly in front of you, unless you use certain attacks in the second stance that you unlock. But I basically never use that stance ever, and it's not like the normal enemy encounters are that challenging in the first place, which is part of the problem. Regardless, I just think in general, this combat just feels a little unpolished and far too repetitive. The only reason that it stays compelling is because of the boss fights. The player controls are just way too simplistic and repetitive. You can say that Souls games' movesets are more simple, which they are, but they also have like over 20 different weapon types that have unique moves. In this, you have the same bow staff and just 3 variations of the light attack combo with a slightly different strong attack and some slightly different properties. But even then, you have to invest skill points into these things, and while you can respec those skill points at any time, the point still stands that this ends up feeling incredibly repetitive and overly reliant on overpowered abilities to make the combat feel good. But the boss fights are an absolute win. I really have no real complaints except for a couple specific fights I thought were bad, but for the most part, I think the boss variety is a really great thing going for this game. Now, believe it or not, for the rest of the aspects of this game, I don't have a whole lot to say. I basically already covered my thoughts on the level design in that I think it's fucking terrible. There's way too many invisible walls everywhere. Everything is a fucking linear path with a couple other branching linear paths. There's no real, like, verticality or climbing. There aren't interesting traps, at least outside of ambush encounters. Like, there's no Sen's Fortress. No platforming sections, not really anything to break up the basic gameplay, and like I said, most normal enemy encounters are easy as shit anyway. So yeah, the level design's not great. I don't think I need to go into it in detail. The only thing I really liked were the secret areas that you had to unlock. That's always good, but the rest was pretty mediocre to bad across the board. As for the visuals, I think the game looks great, but some of the aesthetic choices are kind of bland. Like, the desert level just kind of looks pretty boring. I also think the prison level looks pretty boring, and the gimmick there is horrific. It reminded me a little bit of Tower of Latria from Demon Souls, which is actually one of the best areas in any Souls game, at least in my opinion. Unfortunately, Black Myth Wukong's version is way worse, because instead of having like pseudo-stealth mechanics with the Lovecraftian tentacle guards who could paralyze you with a spell and then grab and pierce you through your skull, sort of encouraging a different type of gameplay style. Plus, the atmosphere is fucking top-notch. Everyone loves the Tower of Latria. It's awesome. Instead, how it works in the Pagoda realm is every something like 5 minutes, you'll hear this mysterious chime which spawns these giant lantern-headed dudes. It cuts your maximum health in half, and all of the enemies become super aggressive, having red eyes. My issue with this mechanic is that it just happens. There is no player interaction with it whatsoever. You're punished for taking your time with the game, and it's a heavy punishment at that. It doesn't feel like a unique challenge. If anything, it makes you just want to run through the area to get to the next bonfire, right? It was an incredibly annoying zone. I find it ironic that the one point of the game where the level design actually mattered was also probably the worst area in the game. But yeah, getting back to the visual aesthetic, I think the Chinese design of the 𝘾𝙤𝙤𝙚 are fairly cool, though there's an overabundance of these ugly furry characters. Now, obviously, they're not sexualized, which is definitely a good thing, but them being just these hideously ugly anthropomorphic animals, I don't know, I'm just not a fan of the design. I don't have any artistic critique of it, but a lot of the more demonic creatures do look cool. As for the story, there really isn't much story to speak of. Not a whole lot of what I would call lore either, like other Souls-likes. There's basically nothing to this. It almost feels like an old arcade game where your grand task is to find these 6 relics so you can revive Sun Wukong, who is turned to stone or he's trapped inside it or something, as you see in the intro of the game. And that's pretty much it. From what I understand, a lot of the stuff that happens in this game are direct references to Journey to the West, which I know is a very famous story, but I haven't read it. And this game really doesn't try to explain on any level what's happening, why I should care about all these side characters who just come and go. I mean, can you imagine if a Lord of the Rings game came out today and you were expected to have read the books or seen the movies to even understand the slightest bit of what's going on? I don't care if every Chinese person has read Journey to the West, which I find unlikely anyway. This is just not a smart way to tell a story. And in between the chapters, they tell these little mini stories that are animated, right? And the second story that was told about some fox that a guy rescues and takes back to his home is some of the most alien shit I have ever seen in my life. I know there's culture shock, like not all cultures are the same, especially Eastern ones often have very different types of stories than Western ones. But let me just give you a summary of the story and tell me if this makes sense to you. So a man finds an injured fox. He takes it back to his home and bandages up its leg. He then goes to sleep and wakes up and sees the fox has turned to a beautiful woman. And long story short, she becomes his wife. He starts a family with her. And then one day, tragedy strikes as I guess one of their daughters is like some kind of demonic fox-human hybrid and kills his family. Of course, this is all a dream. He wakes up, he looks at the fox, and then there's a hard cut, almost as if this is a setup for a joke, and he skinned the fucking fox. Oh. What the fuck? Alright, never mind. Okay. I'm like, wow, what a relatable human experience. No, he has a dream about the fox being a woman, having a family, and then she kills everyone, and he's like, okay, I gotta skin this animal now. You guys wonder why I only trust the white man. Now, what's even stranger about this story is it's actually incorporated into the game. As you make your way through Chapter 3, you'll eventually find the spirit of the fox, and you actually get a chance to avenge her and set her spirit to rest. I don't really think this redeems the story because it still doesn't really make sense, but at the very least, you get some closure. Okay, let's just get to the conclusion. Should you buy Black Myth Wukong? I would say wait for a sale. It's certainly a pretty good game, but ultimately its problems are that it's not quite polished enough in a lot of the important ways that matter, aka the core combat mechanics and the lack of interesting normal enemy encounters. Also, the level design is incredibly amateurish. Not the aesthetics, I think the game looks great, but the actual level design, you exploring a bunch of fucking linear hallways, yeah, that's not compelling on any level, especially if you compare it to something like Dark Souls 1, where a massive part of that game's appeal was the exploration. That said, as I covered with many examples in this review, I think the boss fights are actually quite good. You can tell a lot of the budget, a lot of the time was put into making each boss feel at least slightly unique. And while there are a couple stinkers in there, I'd say overall they are good to great. And there's so many of them. Truly, that is what this game can claim as its own, is having more boss fights than I've probably seen in any action game. Like I said, Black Myth Wukong reminds me a lot of Atomic Heart and Stellar Blade. I can respect a lot of these other countries trying to break into the AAA space because, as you already know if you watch this channel, AAA games are in a worse place than they've ever been. So it is incredibly refreshing to play some games that have no political propaganda in them. But yes, ultimately, if I'm being honest with myself, these are still pretty flawed games. Atomic Heart was definitely the most unique one. Even though there were some inspirations from BioShock, I still think that game definitely felt like a unique experience, very experimental, but it definitely had some serious flaws that I hope are ironed out if a sequel ever comes out. Stellar Blade was unfortunately labeled as a Coomer game and was stuck on the PS5, which no doubt has the gayest player base out of all the consoles, and I say this as a former PlayStation fan. Black Myth Wukong is probably the most polished out of the three, but it's also the least interesting, I would argue. I mean, yes, I think the aesthetic is unique. We haven't really seen a lot of Chinese-inspired mythological games, so that's kind of cool. But the actual gameplay feels too close to a Souls-like in my opinion, but without all of the positives that come with that genre. But to make it clear one last time, I think all three of the games I mentioned are decent, and I really hope the next entries made by these developers are better than the last. And in Stellar Blade's case specifically, I hope when it comes to PC that people actually buy it. As for Black Myth Wukong, it's definitely already a success. At 10 million copies sold at the time of recording this. We're definitely going to see more games from this developer, so I hope they learn from their mistakes. And in an ideal world, some Western developers would learn, hey, maybe we should make some games that don't have left-wing propaganda in them, so real gamers start buying them again. Unfortunately, I don't see that happening anytime soon. Even Japanese developers are falling to DEI, trying to get some of that sweet ESG funding. Gee, I can't wait to review the Dead Rising demake. But if Black Myth Wukong looks interesting to you, why not give it a try? You'll probably, at the very least, get your money's worth. It's a pretty long game, got a decent amount of optional content. Like I said, it's pretty good, and if you've been watching this channel a long time, you know that's high praise from me. So I'll just leave you with ching chong bing bong, and I'll see you next time, guys.
Disgusting black creatures, get out of my sight.